Deputy Chief Justice, Mrs. Mashal, the Mandela family, Professor Ndebele and trustees of the foundation, and the many, many distinguished guests that are here this evening. Good evening to you all. And if there's anyone who believes I should have mentioned them by name, my apologies, I'm really bad on protocol. But I'm very, very honored to be given the opportunity by the foundation to speak to you this evening. We had hoped the president would be the main speaker, and I was asked to come and speak as he is out of the country. What has been fascinating for me this evening is how difficult it is to stand here and speak a year after we lost our dear president. It's really tough. And as I was sitting down there, I was thinking, how did I get here? Why did I agree to this? Will I be able to do it? I think as we remember President Mandela a year after his passing, we've realized as South Africans that we cannot solely claim him as our own in the face of the global acclamation of his contribution to the world as a politician and as a person. And I really would like us not to forget the human character of Mr. Mandela, the person. He had a wonderful sense of humor. And I haven't heard a single person tell a joke as yet. But in the room with him would always be laughter. That's one of the things I remember about him. So when we remember him, as we are solemn and serious, let's also have a sense of lightness, because I think that's what he would want from us. I thought this evening what I would try to do is to perhaps recall Mr. Mandela by reflecting on the words of others and what they might mean to us. As we think of him as a global leader, I recall the words of President Obama, who said, "To the people of South Africa, people of every race and walk of life, the world thanks you for sharing Nelson Mandela with us. His struggle was your struggle. His triumph was your triumph. Your dignity and hope found expression in his life. And your freedom, your democracy, is his cherished legacy. But claim him we must. He laid the foundation for a new society in South Africa, one that can be free of the racial divisions of the past and full of hope for the future. It is still an aspiration, but he believed in this possibility. This prized inheritance, this legacy we're celebrating today, is one that each of us has a duty to nurture and support into maturity. I have seen today some lamentations in the print media about how we are responding to the legacy of President Mandela. But I think rather than bemoan our inadequacies, we should be asking ourselves, how much have I done to make the legacy live? Not I have failed Mandela, because he didn't ask you to do anything. He lived a life you should follow. He lived an example you should try to emulate. So I think let's not lament. Let us seek to replicate. The visual tribute that we will see reflects the key values of President Mandela's life and work. Values of respect, reconciliation, and dignity. These are not the values that Madiba proclaimed from the rooftops. They are values that we can discern in his life. He didn't need to talk about them. We saw them as he took steps in his life. We saw them in his personal conduct. We saw them in his work. I think one of the greatest attributes of President Mandela was his avoidance of pulpit-type moral lectures or pious postures. To him, example was probably the best teacher. As the famous song says, "Asimbonanga uMandela until we do what he does." President Mandela understood that patterns of behavior are not accidental products of nature, but are acquired through social interaction and nurturing. As he observed famously, one of the most powerful ways of children and young adults acquiring values is to see individuals they admire and respect exemplify those values in their own being and conduct. Parents and educators, or politicians, or priests who say one thing and do another send mixed messages to those in their charge, who then learn not to trust them. The question of leadership, he concluded, is therefore of vital importance. I suppose, listening to those words, the most important question we have to answer, as those leaders and adults he referred to, is why are we failing to be that example? And how might we all do better? I'm convinced that President Mandela will always be known as a leader who played a key role through sacrifice, struggle, and commitment in the fight against apartheid. Saying that about him, the individual, I also know he'd be very uncomfortable, because he always spoke of the collective, that it was never the man on his own, it was the man with many others. But I believe the role that he played and his individual contribution with the collective has to be recognized. He said on his release from prison, "I stand here before you, not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place the remaining years of my life in your hands." I remember those words and the moment vividly, as I was there in Green Market, in the Grand Parade in Cape Town, as he said those words. And I have to say to those of us standing there, I think as the crowd, we were expecting him to tell us how the struggle will continue. And here he was saying, I place myself as a humble servant in your service. What a man. He is the leader who chose reconciliation over revenge. He is a leader whose moral courage defined our era of liberation, so much so that our history books will certainly define the period of our early freedom as the age of Mandela. One of the fascinating attributes he had was that of leading without bitterness. He was absolutely willing to reconcile. Some say almost to a fault, but it was absolutely necessary. He put South Africa and its people first. In President Clinton's words, he taught us the freedom of forgiveness and the power of humility. President Mandela laid a very strong foundation for democratic South Africa, a foundation laid through forgiveness, persuasion, and great love for all the people. Yet, this also exemplified great selfless leadership. He said of his commitment to the struggle against apartheid and for freedom, "We all did so, not for any personal gain or material rewards. We took this stand because these were goals we saw as worthy and virtuous." So I think as we remember him today, we need to be careful when we extol him of making him a badge of pride and virtue, because I don't think that was ever his desire, just to be held up as a badge, which then actually causes some of us to believe by holding up the badge, we are Mandela. That's not what he wanted. What I believe he sought was that our conduct would try in some way to reflect the man. He also reminded us that he himself was not a saint, and he would often say this. We need to use the material that is being presented to us today and that we've had access to for the past few years to study his life and work critically. I think he would expect us to do a critical analysis of his contribution, to interrogate some of the steps that he took. The Black American academic Cornel West reminded us in his 2006 lecture that we should not make Nelson Mandela some kind of icon on a pedestal belonging to a museum. He described President Mandela as a wave in an ocean, part of a rich tradition that raises certain kinds of questions, beginning with our own lives and our willingness to muster the courage to examine who we are as humans. I was talking to a university conference this morning, and we were talking about values and what the role of higher education might be in shaping a new society. And I said to my colleagues that if out of institutions that are the repository of the intellectual wealth of our society, if out of them emerge young people who are 22 years old and who choose to attack a poor African woman walking on a street merely because of her color or her poverty, we have to ask ourselves, what values are our universities transmitting to young people? What kind of person are we producing? It's not a question about our curriculum practice. It's not a question about our academic intention. It's a question about whether our institutions can produce a young person who is very different from those of us who might have lived under a racist system. I think my colleagues were a bit unhappy with my comments because I got a lot of very hard questions after my input. But I do think we have to begin to ask ourselves whether we are examining ourselves and our practice and what it is we're creating in our society. Of course, President Mandela was born in and of the struggle. He once famously proclaimed a phrase all of us are familiar with, "The struggle is my life." He was the product of the liberation movement, tempered by a culture of criticism and dialogue, and hardened by the responsibilities of the movement and the accountability of leadership. We recall Oliver Tambo writing to him when it became clear to those in exile that President Mandela had initiated contact with the National Party in the midst of the turbulent 1980s. Oliver Tambo demanded, "You are answerable, Nelson. We want to know what your reasons are for talking with the Boers." But we know that that foundation led us to the peace and reconciliation we enjoy today. It is this tradition of openness, of debate and dialogue that produced the likes of Oliver Tambo, Chief Albert Lutuli, Lillian Ngoyi, Ruth First, Helen Suzman, Walter Sisulu, Albertina Sisulu, and so many others who have served our movement and our nation. The accolades that I believe will form part of the forever living archive of Mr. Mandela must be preserved, as the foundation is doing, as a vibrant social history of the human politics of South Africa. Intellectuals with creative imagination must be asked to devise ways of infusing these materials into multidisciplinary discourse in education at all levels. We should explore how a primary schooler would describe Mr. Mandela and carry that description to a new and higher phase of learning for all young people in our society. We should use these materials so that we do not, in 20 years' time, have a 40-year-old who is racist when he was born in 1994. It just would not make any sense and would not be a fitting tribute to this great man. I thank you very much.
I think, Minister, it's fitting to say that deserves an